Today, we're taking a little bit of a break from talking about COVID-19. We are discussing the history of economics, its birth as a discipline, heterodox and mainstream approaches to economics, and whether studying the history of economics is important for students of economics. My guest today, I'm very pleased to say, is my colleague at Brock, Dr. Robert Dimand. Professor Dimand hails from Montreal, where he attended McGill University, specializing in economics and history for his undergraduate degree. He then earned master's and PhD degrees in economics from Yale University, where his advisor was Nobel Prize winner James Tobin. Professor Dimand has been at Brock since 1987 and has received awards for teaching, research, service, and mentoring. His research is broad, and he has recently been writing the history of the Coles Foundation at Yale University. Professor Dimand, thank you for joining us. First of all, clear this up for us. What is the difference between economic history and the history of economic thought?
So economic history is the history of events. It's what people did to make a living, to produce things, to what they consumed. History of economic thought is intellectual history. It's a history of how people have thought about the economy, how they've analyzed it, how they've proposed changes. So if someone was writing about the Industrial Revolution or about the fur trade, they're writing economic history. If somebody is writing about Adam Smith and his understanding of how markets coordinate individual behavior, that's history of economic thought.
You know, it was common at one point for economics students to take mandatory courses in the history of thought. When and why did this change?
Well, it had changed from the 1960s to the 1980s. When I was an undergraduate at McGill, there was a mandatory two-semester course in the history of economic thought. At Brock, it was mandatory into the middle 1980s until, unfortunately, just before I came to Brock. Partly, it was squeezed out by economics becoming increasingly technical and mathematical. So space had to be found for more courses in econometrics and mathematical methods in economics. And along with that movement towards more econometrics courses, more mathematical economics courses, there were more and more economics faculty whose strengths was in mathematical techniques and not in critically analyzing text or critical reading. Ironically, at one university that had been a major center of history of economic thought, the University of Chicago, it was in fact their leading historian of economic thought, George Stiegler, who was responsible for history of economic thought no longer being required because George Stiegler is prominent with Milton Friedman at the Chicago School of Economics, was very much in favor of giving people more choice, of not having so many required courses, letting people choose what they were taking. And so since history of economic thought was his course, he wanted to make it elective, a matter of choice. And the people who were teaching courses like econometrics at Chicago did not take that approach and did not and insisted on their courses being mandatory.
Was a lot of this a function of the Cold War? And by what I mean by that is, at one point, and this is anecdotal, I was talking to somebody who said that they had to take a Marxian economics course, and this was mandatory for students in his particular university. But after the Cold War, this sort of waned, this tension between capitalist and, neoclassical, maybe heterodox approaches. Is this a function of the Cold War and perhaps a lot of academics having some sympathies for Marxist economic leanings?
The courses in Marxian economics would have been very rare. What would have been much more common would have been courses in comparative economic systems, which would have been overlapping with history of economic thought because many of the same people would have been teaching them, would have been in alternative approaches to organizing the economy and history of economic thought. And what did in the teaching of comparative economic systems was not the Cold War, but the end of the Cold War, when it
I
looked
see. Yeah.
as if it was just one system everywhere. Now at Brock, if you're thinking of Brock University, there you would find, of course, in Marxian economics, but this was, in a way, it's a historical accident of someone having been hired with a letter of appointment that said he was being appointed to teach history of economic thought and Marxian economics.
Right.
The defector from Poland. And in the course of a disagreement with the university about his salary, he chose to work to rule, and he had a letter of appointment saying he was appointed to teach the history of economic thought and Marxian economics. And thereafter, those were the only courses that he would teach. But that's an accident of the history of economics at Brock University and has nothing to do with the Cold War.
Why should economics students care about the history of economics at all?
Well, I think there's three main reasons. One is you get a deeper understanding of mainstream economics if you understand how it evolved, how it developed, if you've actually seen the work of people like Adam Smith and Alfred Marshall, who developed the ideas that you see now. Second, it also gives you a sense of historical perspective to realize that what you get taught in first year undergraduate or first year graduate student is just what economics is at a point in time. It's not the final truth. That in the past, people have believed that wherever they were, this was the final discovery of truth and everything else leads up to them, and you don't need to understand the historical evolution of the field because it's not going to change. So in 1848, John Stuart Mill wrote that happily, nothing remains to be discovered about the theory of value. And this is before marginal utility or marginal cost, marginal revenue. In 1848, he said, well, happily, we now know everything about the theory of value. At every point in the history of economics, people have believed that they've discovered the final truth. And yet, as an empirical matter, it turns out they hadn't, that economics developed beyond that. So studying the history of economics helps one to realize that you're in a field that, like other fields, is evolving, it is changing. You're not learning the final truth, and that there's a much greater variety of approaches than you can get covered in a first year survey course. There's institutional economics, there's behavioral economics, there are the continuing Keynesian versus classical debates in macroeconomics, and by getting a sense of the history of economics, you can get an insight into the diversity of approaches. But it's actually this third reason for studying the history of economics that's the one that was responsible for me going into it. Mm-hmm. And that is simply, it's really interesting that you can that you can derive a lot more pleasure from studying the debates, from studying the Keynes versus classics debates, from reading Adam Smith, from looking at Karl Marx's or Sorstein Veblen's challenge to mainstream thinking, then from doing various exercises. I mean, ordinary least squares is very useful, but it lacks in entertainment value.
Oh, I can see that. I can definitely see that. So that leads me to the next question. What first got you interested in the history of economic thought, and how did you know that you would pursue a career in it?
Well, I was a joint major in history and economics because I'd always had an interest in reading history for fun. So I went to college and university in Quebec, where there's a somewhat different system from the rest of Canada. First, there's a 2-year college called a CEGEP, and then 3 years of university. And I was a science major in CEGEP. The part of the science program that I really enjoyed were the mathematics courses. I didn't like dissecting things in biology. I found that organic chemistry involved too much memorization, but I enjoyed mathematics without being quite good enough at mathematics to have a career is as a mathematics major, but all
Hmm.
my elective courses were history. So I put together the two things I seem to be really good at were mathematics and history. And how do you combine the two? Well, as economics takes advantage of both. But I went and majored in history and economics. And I just found that I really was interested in the history of economic thought. There was as I said, there was a 2-semester sequence before I sequenced in the history of economic thought. So this is somewhat eccentric, but the way I prepared for it is the summer before I took those courses, I read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations cover to cover. And the summer after it, I read Joseph Schumpeter's History of Economic Analysis. And there was
Not usually
also
what students do. That's impressive. That's very
impressive,
impressive.
but there's also a family connection for the Schumpeter,
Oh,
because my parents were refugees from Austria. And my grandmother's cousin, who unusually had a career in economics despite being a woman, not publishing in academic economics, but she became an economist with the British chemicals firm ICI. When she was a young girl, Schumpeter and Hayek and Judith and Mises had been family friends. So she'd known, she mentioned having known
wow.
Schumpeter in Vienna when she was growing up. And she asked me what book I'd like as a birthday present, and I asked for Schumpeter's History of Economic Analysis. And I found it was a really entertaining read.
That's amazing.
And this is clearly, you can tell from this that it's been a little while since I was an undergraduate. One of the textbooks I had to buy for the final year undergraduate advanced economic theory was Keynes's General Theory.
No
The
way.
world has changed a little since
Yeah.
then. And I enjoyed that greatly. And it's because I so much enjoyed reading Smith's and Schumpeter and Keynes that it was clear that history of economic thought was going to be my field, if not economic history.
Right.
Because I'm always interested in the intersections between history and economics. So those were my two areas. And it was also very clear that I would want to do my graduate work in economics, not in history, because economics PhDs get jobs.
They do. Very much
History
so.
PhDs often don't, even if they're quite good.
That is true. As they say, as one historian told me, history by definition has no future,
Yeah,
which is what somebody told me once. But regardless, I'm an economic historian, you're a historian of economic thought. I'd like to talk about some economic thought, if I may.
sure.
In my Principles of Microeconomics course, which introduces students to economics, I have a small unit on the history of thought. And I inform my students that economics as we know it today is a child of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, as you know, is an 18th century epoch in which reason and human rights and human dignity, this idea that we're all made in the image of God, so we have these fundamental rights. These ideas came to the fore during the Enlightenment. So economics is a child of the Enlightenment, and it probably would not have come about without the Enlightenment. To what extent would you say that this simplification is true?
It's true, and you talk about economics as we know it rather than just economics, because
Mhm.
certainly long before the Enlightenment, people were thinking about issues we now consider economic, thinking about how people earned a living, how people should go about earning a living. You can find discussions of the just price, how people should behave in exchange in Aristotle. You
Mhm.
can you can find in other cultures, going back to the dialogue on salt and iron in ancient China, discussions of how people make a living. And through the Middle Ages, the scholastics in universities who were primarily training Catholic clergy to be confessors had to analyze economic behavior along with all other human behavior to understand what was allowed and what was sinful. But economics, as we know it now, emerges in the 18th century with the Scottish Enlightenment philosophers David Hume and Adam Smith, who were not just writing about Smith did not just write the Wealth of Nations, but also the theory of moral sentiments, a work of moral philosophy that comes out of the same set of lectures that the Wealth of Nations did. David Hume, of course, is a famous Enlightenment philosopher, as well as having in his essay of the balance of trade produced what is considered one of the first economic models, and still and one that's still a basis of understanding of balance of payments, adjustment. And in France, the first group of people who considered themselves economists, the physiocrats, Francois Quesnay and Albert Jacques Turgot, were people who contributed to Diderot and D'Alembert's encyclopedia. That was and the encyclopedia was a central work of the French Enlightenment, and includes articles on farmers and on grains by Quesnay and Turgot, writing on fairs. So the first time when people are not just writing about economic issues, but thinking about themselves as economists and thinking of what they're doing as a distinct discipline, it comes about in the 18th century in connection with the French and Scottish Enlightenment.
So that leads me to another question, and that is this. I was talking with Kyle Harper yesterday, who is a historian of ancient Rome, and he was saying that ancient societies and pre-modern societies, if you will, had market systems. They had market economies. So it's not that we didn't have market economies before. It's not that ancient people didn't know what markets were. Why the Enlightenment specifically? Why did the Enlightenment specifically have to happen for economics as a separate field to come about?
The tradition of thought from Aristotle through the medieval scholastics is very much aware of markets and trade, and very much suspicious of markets and trade. Very much concerned that the charging of interest is unnatural. It's usually because it's unnatural for barren metal to agree. Very suspicious of profit-seeking exchange, because exchange is supposed to be to acquire things that you need to consume, not to amass wealth. It's Aristotle who talks about the story of King Midas who prayed to the gods that everything he touched would turn to gold, as an example of how the disastrous consequences of desiring the accumulation of wealth as an end in itself. And the big transition with Adam Smith, and he's building here on other people like Bernard Mandeville, is to regard trading as a beneficial aspect of society, and not as something to be suspicious of, to be analyzing it, looking for instances of sinfulness or unnaturalness, but to look at how self-seeking behavior in markets is nonetheless coordinated as if by an invisible hand to produce benefits, to produce natural order in society, to produce endogenous order without the need for some external authority to prevent the individual actions producing chaos. Though I should mention that Smith only used the phrase invisible hand twice.
I can understand what you're saying in the context of the Greeks and the scholastics, the medieval scholastics, those Catholic scholastics. But was it true of other societies? Was it true of ancient India? Was it true of medieval India or advanced civilizations like China or the Arabs, the Islamic civilizations, that they also viewed trade, that they also viewed money, that they also viewed these things as fundamentally bad and not things to be analyzed separately from?
Well, they analyzed, but analyzed the scholastics analyzed trade in a very sophisticated way, but in a very suspicious and way, as it offering instances of opportunities for sinfulness, for charging more than a just price for engaging in usury, certainly in traditional China, merchants had very, very low prestige compared to the scholar gentry.
Ah.
That commerce was not a well-regarded activity. As also in the Aristotelian scholastic tradition, the ancient Chinese tradition viewed trade as something that is necessary, but not one of the honored occupations of trade compared to the scholar gentry. And similarly, in traditional India, the merchants and the trader and craftsmen within the caste system, they're below the Brahmins, the priestly and scholarly caste, below the Kshatriyas, the warrior and ruler caste. In India as well, merchants are recognized as necessary, but they have very low social prestige. Aristotelian influence on medieval Islamic philosophy.
Okay.
Because Aristotle's writings reached the medieval West by a chain of translations, first being translated from the Greek into Arabic, and then translated into Latin at places like Palermo and Toledo that are on the borderlands between the Islamic world and the Catholic West, places that go back and forth between being Muslim ruled and Christian ruled, so that you get people who speak both languages.
The Enlightenment represents a radical departure in ways of thinking. And that leads me naturally to somebody who we both know, Thomas Kuhn. And I'm going to paraphrase Kuhn's argument here. I'm not going to do justice to the nuance inherent in it. But Thomas Kuhn was a scientist. He was a historian and a philosopher of science. And he has a famous book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which was published, I believe, in the 1960s. Still very much debated today. Thomas Kuhn argues in the book that scientific knowledge does not progress in a linear and continuous manner, but rather through punctuated paradigm shifts or sudden revolutions in thought. We can think of the Enlightenment as one of them. Or if you're a physicist, the Copernican revolution in astrophysics, right?
Or Darwin and evolution in biology.
Yes. Absolutely. That would be another very prescient example. Would you say that economics also follows Kuhn's model of thought development?
Well, this is very much debated within the history of economics. Because, of course, Kuhn doesn't say that it's only the revolutions that cause advances in scientific knowledge. He distinguishes between the advances within normal science, between paradigm shifts, and then the major shifts to scientific revolution. Clearly, at the time of the physiocrats and Hume and Smith, there's a dramatic change in political economy, as it is then called. There is enormous debate about what happened to economics in the 1870s with the emergence of what we now think of as mainstream microeconomics, the writings of Jevons and of Menger and Walras on marginal utility. And there are two different ways of looking at it. And it's been called the marginalist revolution. And that is the way that Jevons would have looked at it. And Jevons viewed what he was doing as marking a revolutionary discontinuity with the work of David Ricardo and John Stuart Mill, that the introduction of marginal technique throughout, and in particular the emphasis on subjective utility rather than on real cost in labor time, marked a revolutionary break. The alternative view is that it's not a marginalist revolution. Anyone who uses the term neoclassical is rejecting Jevons' view of the break and adopting Alfred Marshall's claim that in fact what you have is an evolution. That neoclassical economics is applying new techniques and generalization to extend classical political economy and to bring out its implications. So in Marshall's view, the use of marginalism for marginal utility, marginal revenue, marginal cost, marginal product is a generalization of the classical theory of rent in Ricardo, which emphasized that the distribution of income depends on the margin of cultivation and agriculture. That's where the word margin comes into economics in the theory of rent, and the generalization of Ricardo's numerical example of comparative advantage, which shows the possibility of mutual gains from voluntary exchange, and then other aspects of classical economics, like what's called John Stuart Mill's great chapter on the determination of value in international exchange. So it's a continuing argument as to whether what becomes the mainstream of economics in the 1870s is really neoclassical economics. That is, that it's simply a new version of classical economics, or whether it represents a marginalist revolution, a discontinuity.
So along those lines, one of the first things a student of economics learns is the definition of the discipline. Economics is the study, we are told, of how human beings allocate limited resources to fulfill unlimited wants and desires. Has this textbook definition always captured how we define the field?
So that is Lionel Robbins' definition of economic science as the science of allocating scarce resources among unlimited alternative ends. And it not only doesn't capture all of what economics has been in the past, it also rather misrepresents Robbins, because what he was doing was distinguishing this economic science from the art of political economy. He wasn't saying that this is all of what economists did. He said this is the part of economics that is a science rather than an art. The political economy, advice on public policy, is not something that can be reduced to a science like the natural sciences. And Robbins himself spent his career doing political economy, not economic science. It's also rather remarkable that in 1932, in the Great Depression, when there's so much unemployed labor around, that it's a definition that restricts economics to the case where all resources are scarce. Because one would have thought in 1932 that there's a lot of instances where that constraint is not binding. But it is offered also as an alternative to Alfred Marshall's view of economics as a study of mankind in the ordinary business of life, which emphasizes not the logic of choice, but what people are doing. And more generally, in the classical view, it's a study of provision, how people support themselves, satisfy their material wants. Whereas you'll notice that the Robbins definition about the logic of choice is nothing about material wants or eating and producing goods and services, but about any analysis of choice. And it also, the classical economists were more concerned with the distribution of income, and in particular, the distribution of income among classes like landlords, capitalists, workers, as opposed to rational individuals making constrained, optimizing choices.
We have a crude way of categorizing economics today into two broad camps, neoclassical and heterodox. So neoclassical, which is the mainstream way of doing economics taught in most grad schools, emphasizes things like equilibrium analysis, utility maximization, lots of math, right? Whereas heterodox approaches include Austrian, PostKeynesian economics, Marxian economics, econophysics, etc. Is such a distinction between neoclassical and heterodox schools arbitrary and illusory?
To some extent, it's arbitrary. I mean, it's a bit like classifying animals into giraffes and non-giraffes. I mean, it is a true distinction, but for what purpose? And for example, among the heterodox schools, Austrian economics is very, very different in its approach to the role of the state and what economists should be doing, from Marxian or post-Keynesian or institutionalist economics. And in fact, Austrian economics has its roots in the work of one of the three people considered the founders of neoclassical economics, Karl Menger. With just the differences, the emphasis, and instead of an emphasis on solving for equilibrium, the Austrian emphasis is on how you get there, on the market process, rather than the ultimate equilibrium. And of course, among the heterodox approaches, econophysics is every bit as mathematical as anything mainstream.
Very true.
It's just a rather different sort of mathematics.
Yeah.
As a historical description, yes, there was a long period of dominance of a mainstream of economics that could best be described as neoclassical, and that, in fact, what set economics apart from the other social sciences is that economics had a mainstream in the way that political science or sociology or anthropology did not. Now, in the last few decades, with the rise of behavioral economics, it's no longer as true. It still describes what gets taught in first-year courses. But if you look at what economists actually do in research, it's no longer nearly so universal, yet we assume that we have rational individuals with given preferences solving constrained optimization problems. You look at recent Nobel Prizes to behavioral economists like Richard Thaler, Robert Shiller, and even to Daniel Kahneman, who's a psychology professor. The mainstream of economics is no longer as monolithic as for many decades it was.
So aside from behavioral economics, would you say that mainstream or neoclassical economists, which is basically most of us, can have anything to learn from, say, Austrian economics or post-Keynesian approaches or Marxian approaches to economics, anything, or econophysics, like, for example?
Oh, yes. I mean, certainly, you'll notice in the responses to the global financial crisis, when it suddenly realized that such things are possible, there was a dramatically renewed interest in Keynes and in post-Keynesian economists, most notably Hyman Minsky. That it suddenly was realized that, oh, you shouldn't really have macroeconomic models in which there's no financial sector and which it had the financial sector running into problems that will, is not going to matter for the whole economy. So abruptly there's a renewed interest in Keynes and Minsky post-Keynesian economics. Also, a renewed interest in Hayek and Austrian economics. In financial economics, not only behavioral finance, but econophysics has had a much greater influence in the understanding of financial markets than one would guess from many university courses, because it would seem to be that a lot of things in financial markets are not normally distributed.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
There are shocks out there. There are fat-tailed distributions. There that approaches like physics-based approaches like fractals actually give considerable insight into what goes into financial markets. One tends not to mention that in an introductory course, because these are going to be things that are going to be sort of difficult to put on a midterm or final exam in the first course. But econophysics is having a big influence on financial economics.
Yeah.
And in the research that economists actually do as opposed to their undergraduate teaching, the new institutional economics is very influential.
Yeah, I'm partial to both approaches, econophysics and new institutionalism as well. My next two questions have to do with you, actually, and the advice you can give to others, because you are a very prolific researcher. You have 105 refereed journal articles, 5 books, 13 edited volumes, 59 book chapters, and you've given over 100 academic talks. What tips would you give younger scholars who seek to be more productive in their work?
Read widely and look for things that interest you. You're going to do much, much better work if you're working on something that you're interested in, as opposed to, well, you know, this is a field that apparently has good job prospects. I will make myself do it
Yeah.
whether I care or not. And in particular, read until you find something that surprises you, or, you know, I didn't realize that looks remarkable. So, for example, my doctoral dissertation, which became the book on the origins of the Keynesian revolution, where that originates is I discovered that in the years before Keynes published the general theory, every year he'd give a series of 8 lectures at Cambridge on the current state of his own research, because he had an unusual teaching job. Because he became well off after publishing The Economic Consequences of Peace, he told Cambridge University they didn't have to pay him for lecturing, but in return, he got to lecture on what he wanted to lecture on. And so what he lectured every year was 8 lectures on what, in effect, is the current draft of whatever book he was writing. And I discovered that a number of his former students, in particular 2 from Canada, had attended his lectures year after year from 1932 to 1935 and had kept their notes. So what you have is, in effect, an annual draft of the general theory as he's
Incredible,
working.
incredible.
And another thing that got me into the Journal of Money, Credit, and Banking was from just bringing together reading 2 different things, reading 2 literatures that had not been read by the same person. So one of the classic stories in Canadian economic history is about the playing card money of New France.
Mm-hmm.
And in that literature, it talks about how after the British conquest of New France, there were negotiations to try and get the French government to pay off the holders of the playing cards. And these negotiations were conducted through the British embassy in Paris, that was established at the end of the 7 Years' War. And they're carried out by a diplomat at that embassy, a Mr. Hume. But because I also worked in the history of economic thought, and the history of monetary economics, I realized that, wait a minute, David Hume, the philosopher and economist, was secretary of the British embassy in Paris at that time. The British diplomat, who's referred to just as Mr. Hume without a first name in the Canadian economic history literature, that is the famous Hume.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote a long memo about the Canadian paper money that all the people who write about Hume as a monetary economist had missed because they're not reading the Canadian monetary history. And so there's an actual, it's the one additional thing about money that Hume wrote that wasn't in his published essays. Another example of something that I came across by just putting things together from 2 different literatures. They didn't get so much. It's an article that didn't get as much attention as these other ones, but I like it. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations talks about the late resolution of the Quakers of Pennsylvania to set at liberty their Negro slaves.
Mm-hmm.
And so what he's done about it is he then offers a rather cynical remark, and from this we can conclude that they didn't own very many.
Okay.
But the interesting thing I noticed is that I was reading about the emancipation of the slave belonging to the Philadelphia Quakers. And I saw when it had happened in 1776. And I thought, wait a minute, The Wealth of Nations was published several months before that. Smith was talking about something that hadn't happened yet. And what turns out
Oh, that's
is that
unusual.
someone in Philadelphia named Benjamin Rush, who's probably best or better known as one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, in the course of debates in Philadelphia about whether the Quakers should free the Negro slaves, he spread a false report in Europe through the Physiocratic Journal Ephemeride de Citoyen about the Philadelphia Quakers having done it, so that they received so much praise for it that they were embarrassed into actually doing it.
So this is fascinating, actually. No, I didn't know about this, and I don't think a lot of my listeners would have known about this. That's very interesting. And a lot of people will be interested from what you've said and from what they've read and from the courses that they've been taking into considering a career in research on the history of economic thought. What advice would you give those people, in addition to the advice you've already given?
But reading widely, I would strongly recommend develop a second field in economics. Don't rely on getting hired just to teach the history of economics, but keep in mind that you're probably going to have good opportunities for teaching economics in places like liberal arts colleges, where they're very concerned with writing intensive courses and writing across the curriculum, because people who do history of economic thought are going to be much better placed to engage students in extensive critical reading and in writing papers than people who are doing the more quantitative and statistical courses. But you also want to have a second field in a second teachable field in economics, but you want to read widely, put things together from different literatures where people haven't noticed the connections. Do something that really interests you, because you do much better work if you're really committed. And since it is also not just an area of economics, but an area of history, remember to focus on primary sources. Remember that you don't want to judge Adam Smith or David Ricardo or Karl Marx just from somebody writing about them, because people have all sorts of axes to grind. You want to judge them from what they've written themselves, and you want to always look at also at the reactions of their contemporaries to get a sense of what they're doing in context.
Very useful advice. Thank you so much, Dr. Dimand, for being with us today. We very much appreciate it. It has been a wonderful pleasure. Thank you. And
thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity.
Have a good day. Bye.
Have a great day.